Charlie Hebdo produced another edition of its magazine this past week. The staff says it has distributed 5 million copies, a print run 80 times higher than normal. The official estimates of the size of that unity rally in Paris, upwards of 1.5 million people, would make it the biggest demonstration in French history. Those numbers are indicative of how powerfully invested millions are in the value of freedom of speech and the affront that the murder of those journalists and the police trying to protect them represents. Grief is a powerful emotion, one that political leaders have been known to exploit. The rally was, among other things, a grade A photo opportunity, but some of the presidents, prime ministers, and ambassadors who stood shoulder to shoulder in Paris, symbolizing their commitment to freedom of expression, have at home turned their backs on the very same ideals. Twitter was alight with Turks, Egyptians, and Russians, among others, calling out their governments for that hypocrisy. The debates taking place around this story come in myriad forms: news conferences, editorials, blogs, broadcasts, and ever more cartoons. And making sense of one of the dominant themes in the news coverage, that civil society must confront an enemy within, is complicated by the fact that nobody really seems to know who that enemy is. Our starting point this week, once again, is Paris. In a story that, when boiled down to its essence, is about the power of images and the way those images are perceived, this one speaks volumes. Political leaders on a Paris street being seen defending freedom of expression. Among them, the Prime Minister of Turkey, which is one of the world's leading jailers of journalists, and the foreign ministers of Russia and Egypt, where freedom of the press and freedom of expression are both quaint notions since dispensed with. There are photo opportunities, then there are photo opportunists.
The march was important for the French people to kind of grieve, in a way, to kind of come to terms with what had happened, but at the same time it highlighted some hypocrisy in the fact that many of these leaders have been quite rightly criticized over the past few years for actually not being real defenders of freedom of speech.
There's no other motivation than political expediency. I'm not surprised. These are politicians, they have careers and they have agendas, and they want to get on board. The other thing is that Western governments themselves have used terrorism as a means by which to curtail and diminish not just freedom of speech, but all sorts of other freedoms as well, in the name of a security agenda. And there's an irony in that, if not a contradiction.
However, Senegal's president, Macky Sall, may have outdone his peers in Paris. Having established his freedom of expression credentials in the land of liberté, he flew back to Dakar, where his government quickly banned not just Charlie Hebdo, but also Libération, a French newspaper whose title requires no translating. When Charlie Hebdo published what it called its Survivors Edition on Wednesday, news organizations were faced yet again with a dilemma: to show or not to show.
Because you're not even showing it. It's this, which is completely crazy, that in UK you cannot show a simple drawing as that. With Mohammed
here at Sky News, we've chosen not to show that cover.
As Charlie Hebdo covers go, this one seemed intended to be less incendiary than the most notorious ones, showing the Muslim prophet with a sign saying, "Je suis Charlie."
On one hand, it's incredibly important that Charlie Hebdo was not silenced by this attack. On the other hand, I take issue even with the cover depiction. It continues to propagate racist depictions of Arabs. I mean, Prophet Muhammad is only Prophet Muhammad to Muslims. To anyone else, he's just an Arab man in history. And so to present an Arab man with a hooked nose, why is that any less offensive than if it was the depiction of a Jewish man with a hooked nose? That would be considered utterly outrageous. It wouldn't be celebrated, it would be condemned.
It's almost as if they couldn't help themselves. It's like saying, well, actually, we understand that not all Muslims agree with what these people did, but at the same time, we'll still rub your face in it, because we can. And it almost feels like, because we can, we must. It's very, very sad, because it does feel to me like we're just waltzing into a dynamic where there's no middle ground possible.
Le 11 septembre des Français.
Characterizing the Paris shootings as the French 9/11, as some news outlets have, was as inevitable as it was disproportionate. However, there are echoes of 2001, 2002 in the rhetoric on the airwaves, similar doses of misinformation being administered.
And in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in. And
Fox calls this man a terrorism expert. Prime Minister Cameron, who tends to choose his words with care, called him a complete idiot. Another American journalist, more widely traveled and better informed than most, went on CNN to say that the false expertise syndrome is by no means limited to Fox News.
I think that CNN and MSNBC and Fox are engaging in the terrorism expert industrial complex, where you have people on as paid analysts that are largely frauds who have made a lot of money off of portraying themselves as terror experts and really don't have the scholarly background or on-the-ground experience to justify being on your network or any other network.
Al Jazeera was another network to have its coverage turn into a debate, including within. An email from one executive producer was eventually leaked, revealing a variety of opinions and approaches to the story. Media watchers soaked it all up.
The leak of Al Jazeera emails shows that even within one organization, people have various views and opinions over what constitutes or not freedom of expression, about where the line should be drawn. And the fact that it generated so much media coverage also shows the media's interest in covering the media.
In a way, it should be seen as a healthy sign that disagreement can take place in an editorial room. And I think it's very important that these debates take place. And I mean, it would seem quite hypocritical as well for a lot of the media who have been defending freedom of speech to then attack people who actually are dissenting.
And that gets to the heart of the bigger story, one that lies well beyond the pseudo-experts peddling beliefs instead of knowledge, beyond the circulation figures of a single magazine, or the show of solidarity, the photo op that cynical leaders reduced to a caricature just by showing up. There are bigger issues attached to this story that are not getting the coverage they deserve.
Actually, the real threat to freedom of speech in Europe increasingly comes less from, I think, for terrorists in this case, and more so from the reactions from our governments, the sort of legislation that's being brought in that increasingly seeks to curb free speech in the name of some sort of exceptionalism justified through terrorism. And I think that's really where the concern should lie.
The fact is, there is a debate to be had about when it is right to publish offensive material and when it's not right. Everybody has the right. That's not an issue. That's the simplest thing in the world to say. The next question is the hard question. When is it right to exercise that right to freedom of speech? And if we can't now have a debate about the proper limits of freedom of speech without appearing to be disloyal to freedom of speech. And we're heading into very, very dangerous waters if we can't do that, because if you can't debate freedom of speech, well then that's an irony, isn't it?
On the download this week, our viewers and what they make of the coverage of the ongoing developments in Paris.
Retweeting Charlie Hebdo cartoons fails to address the contextual issues in France. It creates a polarised view of them being the Muslims and us. Historically, satire has been used as a tool to criticise those in a position of power. Sharing bigoted images of a religious figure is offence for offence's sake. And given the systematic marginalisation of Muslims in France and the West, this creates a toxic environment.
A lot of people have been and will be insulted by Charlie Hebdo's content, and of course, and also, so what? There's no reason why Islam can't be mocked as much as any other religion. If Hebdo was a purely anti-Islamic magazine, this would be a completely different story. However, a simple web search will show you how they attack every faith for all of their backwards views, which is an honourable attempt, in my opinion, to modernise our world and bring these issues to the forefront.